Hi, this is Chip LoCoco. Welcome to my podcast channel. Today, I'm honored to have as my guest Ronald Rychlak. Ron is a distinguished professor of law at Ole Miss. He has written extensively on law subjects. However, why he's here today is to discuss a topic very close to his heart. Ron is a leading scholar on the role of Pope Pius XII in World War II. It's a very hot topic with the opening of the Vatican Secret Archives in March of 2020. Welcome, Ron.
Thanks, Chip. It's great to be here. And congratulations on your work, which has just been honored, your book. I'm very, very happy to hear that.
Thank you very much. So, Ron, you're over at Ole Miss. My son's at LSU and my daughter's at Auburn. So I will say that SEC is very well represented today.
Excellent.
On October 9th, 1958, in an antechamber inside the Pope's summer residence at the Castel Gandolfo, the Jesuit priest, Reverend Francesco Pellegrino, announced to the world via Vatican radio the death of beloved Pope Pius XII. Just as an aside, my dad was a seminarian at the Gregorian University and was asked to go sit with the body at the Castel Gandolfo of Pope Pius XII. Wow. He did the night before the funeral. The accolades from the world leaders flooded in immediately after his death. Those included Jewish leaders, correct?
Absolutely. Virtually every major Jewish organization around the world, Jewish leaders, Golda Meir, all over, praised them for standing up for the Jews in their darkest hour.
And I guess that's what I want to point out. The Jewish leaders did not just offer their condolences, but they went on to thank the Pope for everything he did for the Jews during World War II.
That's right. The Jews of Rome put a big placard up thanking him. Money was sent in his name. Contributions were made. He was, without doubt, considered a hero.
And those accolades after his death matched the words of Pius's Jewish contemporaries right after the war. Would that be correct? The Jewish leaders at the time.
Again, I mean, the chief rabbi of Rome not only converted to Catholicism, but actually took Eugenio, Pius XII's Christian name, as his Christian name. And that was all over the place. There were tributes and thanks, just overwhelming amount.
So the words and accolades from then do not fit with the controversy regarding Pope Pius of today. And that really all changed in the 1960s. And I would like you just to explain to the audience what changed. What was the reason, do you believe, for the change?
Well, thanks, Chip. I think this is one of the most important aspects of the story that is still not well known, although it's come out more over the last decade than ever before. But the truth of the matter is, after the war was over, the Soviet Union, which was atheistic, communistic, had a tremendous pull over and control over great parts of Eastern Europe that previously had been very Catholic, very Christian, very religious areas. And we saw in nation after nation, the new Soviet leaders would buddy up to the cardinals, Wyszynski in Poland, Stepanek in Croatia, Barand, Minzente in Hungary. And they would say, we're just like these guys. We stood against the Nazis like these great Catholic leaders you have here. And then within 2 years, each one of those guys was in prison for collaboration with the Nazis. It was actually a coordinated campaign coordinated through the Kremlin as a way to discredit Christianity, the Catholic Church, religion itself. If you can say that these religious leaders were actually crypto-Nazis or Nazi collaborators, you really bring down the whole concept of religion. And that's how the Soviets tried to remove religion from the new areas where they had control over. And they, in fact, tried to use something similar to that to bring down Pope Pius XII at the time. But he was not under their control. They couldn't rig the evidence. They couldn't frame him the way they framed these other leaders. So they had to delay and use a different tactic to get him.
And what was that tactic to get him?
In the late 1950s and early 1960s, they coordinated and developed a play The purported author of it, Ralph Holkwith, a German Protestant who'd never written a play, but he'd been working on one, apparently. And they got him, and they really ran it through a committee. And the committee came up with an 8-hour-long play because it had every piece of propaganda you could possibly think of put into it. They developed it, coordinated it. They rewrote it numerous times. They did test markets for Soviet leaders. If they didn't like it, they changed something. When it came time to actually produce it for the public, they got Erwin Piscator, a great theatrical producer-director, although an avowed communist who said the whole purpose of his theater was to support communism. They brought him into a new theater company in West Berlin. This was right after the wall had gone up. And they wanted an outlet for propaganda in West Berlin. So they created this new theater company devoted specifically to communist propaganda plays. They brought Piscator in. This was the first play that he produced. He said, "This is the whole purpose of my of being in theater." He cut it down from 8 hours to 2 hours, made it presentable. They then translated it and produced it in every communist nation, really under the Soviet sphere, on an annual basis. They had it, and they created this myth. The play actually even made it to Broadway in 1963.
The play's name was The Deputy?
The Deputy. The play's name is The Deputy. I'm sorry, I didn't say that yet. And the Deputy meaning, Christ's deputy on earth. And it's the story actually was made into a movie about 20 years ago called Amen. And it's about a priest, a good priest, who discovers what's happening and tries to get to the Pope to reveal the truth to the world. And the Pope sort of doesn't care. That's essentially the thumbnail sketch of the play. And the most interesting thing was, I mean, everybody talked about how this play had flipped perception. And that's, no one really questions or doubts that. The thing that's new that was revealed for the first time in 2007 by Jan Mihai Pacepa, who was a communist leader in Romania, who was right-hand man to Ceausescu. He said it was a foreign intelligence operation that he was involved in to promote this play, produce this play, use this play to discredit the papacy, the Catholic Church, Christianity, and religion itself, and advance in that manner the Soviet cause. And there's a certain brilliance to it, because when the play came out, highly critical of that, they put an appendix, very unusual for a play, but sort of a justification, almost like footnotes. I think they call it sideline to history, or side notes to history. And numerous scholars and people who were with firsthand knowledge pointed to the play and said, "This is wrong, and this is wrong, and this is wrong." And the answer was, well, of course, there's artistic liberty. We had to make some changes for the theater, but it's fundamentally right. And every time you could punch 100 holes in it, and they always said, "Yeah, but we had to do that for the theater, but fundamentally it's right." Dan Brown kind of did that with his books as well, Da Vinci Code and stuff. It's a technique. You can take a fictional story and make a point, and it becomes unassailable, because you agree and say, "Yeah, well, we had to change something a little," and that created this debate. And that didn't end everything, though. There's this fascinating thing that happens. This play raises the issue in the 1960s, and that gets the attention of scholars. And for instance, there's a guy named Carlos Falconi who decides he's going to write a book, and he's going to focus on Croatia, where Cardinal Stepanek had been one of the people framed by the Soviets after the war. And he gets all of the materials from the prosecution and puts it out as a book, a history book that is still cited today, even though today we now know that everything he got was crafted and put together by the communist leaders who were aware that he was writing a book, and that they had to be very careful because they knew if he got to the truth, it would reveal what they had done. So they gave him selected stuff. I'm going to say that he was acting in good faith, I think. But people who still rely upon him, like, for instance, John Cornwell did when he wrote Hitler's Pope, there's no excuse for that. And the people who crafted the evidence that was used against Stepanek escaped and came forward and said, here's how we manufactured it. Here's what we did. We have notes we have minutes from meetings where basically the communist leaders are saying, this guy Falcone is asking for documents. What can we give him? What do we have to do? How do we cover the tracks we left behind? So to me, but see, a snowball happens.
Right.
Snowball happens with that. And,
well, it's funny because you said, in furtherance of the perception of Pius XII being flipped, you mentioned Cornwell's book, Hitler's Pope. That book was released, I think, in 1999.
Right.
In that book, he portrays Pius as a staunch anti-Semite who, again, doesn't care about the plight of the Jews. A major response to that book came out in 2000, and that was a book by none other than you called Hitler, the War, and the Pope. Were you involved in the scholarship of Pope Pius XII prior to that time, or was that kind of how you got into it?
It's sort of funny. It's almost, if you want to look for a miracle along the way, one of them was a colleague said, the Pope was a Nazi. That's what got me started. And this was probably at least 5 years before that. So it was probably about 1995. And it was interesting, I started doing research, pulling things down, going to the library. First I went to the public library, then the university library, then I'm writing away and getting books. And you get one book that says he was a great hero, another book said he should have been tried at Nuremberg. And I tried to answer that. And I end up putting together first a column for our Catholic newspaper here in Mississippi. And I almost would have stopped there. Actually, what happened, the reason I didn't stop there, I came down for the first time ever in my life with sort of a health issue. I got Bell's palsy, and Bell's palsy made me, I could teach my class in the morning, but basically I went home and I was wiped out, but I had my first ever little laptop, and I started putting together my notes that I'd been collecting for several years. I recovered from Bell's palsy, in 2 or 3 months. And by that time I had the frame of the book. I filled out the book, had the book. The book literally was at the publisher waiting to be printed. Probably would have been printed at another publisher. This publisher kind of stalled around and didn't quite get it done. And then Hitler's Pope comes out. I had no idea Hitler's Pope was going to come out, but it's 180 degrees different from my book. And so I called the publisher. Then I said, hey, look, let's hold off and see if we can, take a look at this book that's so different than mine and make sure I didn't miss. And part of it was, did I miss something? I read Hitler's Pope. I realized I hadn't missed anything. I actually wrote a review of it that got me invited to the Vatican. The Vatican gave me an office and said, here are the materials we provided for John Cornwell. These are materials that Cornwell said left him in a state of moral shock. Please tell us whether he was honest. It's the only instruction they gave me. And I'm sitting in this office for about a day and a half, really scared to death because there's 1,000 pages, transcripts in different languages, and I'm supposed to figure out how this left them in a state of moral shock. And it's like, they've wasted their money. They brought me over here. I don't know. And then I realized they had a copy of his book, and the book had footnotes. Footnotes direct me to the pages that supposedly left them in a state of moral shock. Those pages all were in English, so I didn't have to worry about language issues. And there were like 33, I made a graph, I put it in the book, I think 33 or so citations he had. Not a one of them, literally not a one related to anti-Semitism or the Pope not caring about the Jews or anything like that. He read these things and he cited them. He would cite them for things like, the Pope had special food because when he was in school because he was sick, or somebody said this thing or that thing. Nothing at all was indicative of the Pope's bad treatment or bad action on behalf of Jews or anything. In fact, he and I had an exchange, Cornwell and I had an exchange then in Brill's Content magazine where I pointed that out. And the only thing he came up with was there was an allegation once of a flirtation between the Pope and his housekeeper. And that was the only thing that Cornwell can come up with. And he said, what a dull boy our professor must be not to find this interesting. And I said, well, maybe I'm dull, but it's got nothing to do with the Jews or the Holocaust or Hitler or whatever.
Like a good attorney, I will say that you really cross-examined that book very well.
Thank you.
And your book really, I guess, changed. Am I fair to say that it did change Cornwell's feelings somewhat on the subject?
He subsequently came out and said that the Pope had, I think he phrased it he had less opportunity to do things than than Cornwell had originally thought. So I think Cornwell backed off a little bit on his claims, but I think a lot of serious scholars dropped Cornwell as a serious account at that time. So
we're going to flash forward to March of 2020. The Vatican Archives are open to scholars relative to the time period of Pope Pius XII during World War II. It seems as though since they've been open, I know they opened very shortly and then COVID came, so they closed, but now they kind of open again. Seems like new articles are written once a month about some document somebody found, and this is the smoking gun. I know David Kurtzer, who's a historian, he has a book coming out, I think it comes out tomorrow, called The Pope at War. I know it's been out in different languages. I think it comes out in English tomorrow. I guess my question to you is, and I'll say this first, that Kurtz acknowledges, I read an article just last night where he acknowledges that his book does not contain a smoking gun. And I guess, I just wanted to get your thoughts on kind of the opening of the archives and what you think so far.
Sure. Well, yeah, I actually had my credentials all lined up to go over there in 2020. I had scheduled a trip and then it shut down. And so we had to cancel the trip. It opened briefly, then reclosed, and I have not rescheduled. Simply, I've got other things in my life to do sometimes. And frankly, I'll be honest, I saw Kurtzer give a talk, and he was very proud. He had this picture where it's himself, I think Hubert Wolff, and one of the critical people of Pius XII, who were the first three in line to go into the archives when they opened. And I couldn't help but thinking that just looked a little bit silly to me. I don't care who the first person is to find the document. I care about understanding the document, putting it in context. And it's good that there are people who are anxious to do this and to bring forth the evidence. And I'm all for looking at the evidence. But let's not rush into things and make mistakes, because that's already, in fact, I mentioned Hubert Wolff, that already happened. He had an article that came out early. He found a document that he thought was indicative of bad things inside the Vatican, and then he is backed off of that statement. He said, no, I overreacted. He himself said that. And I think Kurtzer's, I've been asked to review Kurtzer's book, but I haven't got my copy yet. The review copy should be arriving any day. I did read an article he published just last week, where apparently one of the big things that he has found is a transcript where early during the Nazi era, there's a meeting between a Nazi representative and either the Pope or a representative of the Pope. We'll see how clear that is, because I think the article was less clear than I'd like to. But anyway, consider it the Nazis in the Vatican. And the discussion, in essence, was the Vatican was saying, hey, can you let the church operate? The Catholics, we will try to cooperate and be and not create problems, but we have to have our mass and our church and our schools, and can we continue to operate? And to someone in 2022 looking at that, they can say, the church is cutting a deal with the Nazis. Well, this is 39. This is 3 years before the Wannsee Conference, before the final solution's been decided upon. This is a new governmental entity coming into place. This is the church trying to make sure it can protect people, it can continue to function. I don't think you can charge the Vatican with knowing what the Nazis would end up doing. And I think if we look at what Pope Francis has currently done with China, trying to work deals with China, I think when the Soviets came into Poland, Cardinal Wyszynski, who's known as a clear anti-communist, anti-Soviet guy, he tried to work with them. He tried to make that happen. The real political approach that the Vatican used under Pope John the 23rd and Paul VI was a matter of recognizing that there are evil governments in the world, and we still have to work with them.
I think also that the scholars have to be very careful when they use internal memos, for example, among staff. I mean, all I can do is take it from the standpoint of I'm an attorney like yourself. And, you can have a case and you have internal memos regarding that case, and some ideas that are thrown out are so out of whack, right? Or just so, but it's just part of the process, right? To find an internal memo and say this means that the Pope was involved in that or believe that can lead to a faulty premise.
That's exactly what Wolf did with that first memo. He found an internal memo attributed maybe a far off theory to the Pope, which wasn't at all. Yeah, when you're making decisions, you consider everything. You look at everything. But I think when you're the Vatican, you're the Pope trying to engage in international relations, you try to establish relations, protect your people, and be able to operate. And maybe that way you influence the government in the long run instead of creating a hostile environment from the start.
So what I want to do now is, we really can't talk about Kurtz's book because I haven't read it, you haven't read it, but I think we can talk about just some of the thoughts and comments that scholars who are against the Pope or believe he didn't do enough, it all kind of falls in with the same kind of argument. I kind of want to go through those arguments and have you discuss each one, okay? The first being, sure. This is the first statement that you'll see a lot of, the Nazis were thrilled with the election of Pope Pius XII. I'm going to stop there because I don't want you to answer that, because before we give an answer, I want you to talk about the early beginnings of, we're not going to say Pope Pius XII, we're going to say of Eugenio Pacelli, who was Pope Pius XII before he became Pope. He was a citizen of Rome. He was born in Rome. And I want you really to hone in on his time he spent in Munich, when, of course, at the same time, Hitler was on the rise in Munich. Can you discuss his early days in Munich?
Sure. I mean, and number one, just the premise of the question is silly. No, that the Nazis were not at all pleased with this election. But going back to Munich, so he's a papal representative in Munich. This is World War I. This is before the Nazis were in power when he went there, but he was there as he watched the Nazis rise in power. And in fact, he wrote a letter. He was quoted in a newspaper, I want to say in 1921, I may have the date wrong, but 1921, where he's concerned about influences from the opposite side of the communists who are just as bad and just as dangerous. And then I believe it's 23, he writes a letter to the Vatican where he specifically names Hitler and his followers are dangerous. They are persecuting Jews and Catholics. And he pointed to a Catholic bishop who was setting a good example for standing up for the Jews. I just read an updated piece on this the other day. I think we have records from like 44 talks that he gave, speeches he gave in Munich at this time. And in like 40 of them, he condemned racialism or not. They weren't known as Nazis yet. So racists or the praising of the bloodlines or whatever. The kind of things clearly that was evolving as he was watching Hitler and Ludendorff and develop the Nazis in that town. And it is ironic, ironic's the word, that Hitler and Pope were in the same city at that time as Hitler is coming to power. So he saw what was going on and he was critical of it. He was critical of it publicly. He was critical of it in speeches. He wasn't deceived. He knew what was going on.
I'm going to mention her here just because I'm going to come back to the very end of our podcast. But at that point, he met Sister Pascalina Leinhardt, who became his housekeeper, eventually his confidant, and she stayed with him from all the way back from his days in Munich till the day of his death. But I'll come back to that in a second. All right. So relative to, we have the Pope, we have Eugenio Pacelli's working under Pope Pius XI in Munich. Eventually, he's called back to the Vatican, where he becomes the Secretary of State. As the Secretary of State, two things happen, which I want you to talk about. One is the Concordat with Italy and Germany, and the other one would be the encyclical that Pope Pius XI wrote. Take the Concordat first.
Yeah, the Concordat is the agreement between the Vatican and Germany, which in essence, prior to, Pope Pius XI, when he assumed the papacy, and from the early years of his papacy, there were a lot of Catholic parties, political parties, and that's how the Catholic Church kind of used its influence. Well, that became very problematic in a number of ways, and that the parties were sometimes intimidated. The Catholic Center Party in Germany was actually intimidated into supporting the Nazis at one point, even though the bishops forbade communion to Nazis. So I mean, there was a weird thing. So Pius XI decided he wanted to have agreements, concordats, or agreements or treaties that would lay out the rights of the church in the various nations. And he negotiated something like 15 of these with various nations and some individual states within Germany. But he wanted to have one, and they had proposed one to the Weimar Republic before the Nazi came to power. And so that basically, this proposal was laying on the desk when Hitler comes to power. And Hitler picks it up, looks at it, and says, we'll sign this. And, can get the Pope on the phone. Well, I want to sign this agreement with Germany. And the proposal was made to Germany, not to the Nazis. And the agreement survived until the 1950s. It survived far past the Nazi era. So this is an agreement between two nations, not between governments. Well, when that happens, when the Nazis say we want to sign this thing, they basically said, we'll take the deal that you proposed, or we'll make it very, very hard on you. Take your pick. So the church, Pius Pacelli, Eugenio Pacelli, who was Secretary of State, is actually quoted by a British diplomat saying, we have a pistol pointed to our head. We either take the deal that we proposed, or we're gonna have a very hard time. So the Vatican ultimately signed this agreement, which if you look at it, it's people like to point out that they'll try to say, it stopped you from talking about politics. Church doesn't talk about politics. In fact, Pacelli insisted on an amendment to the original agreement that said there are no way, pastors are in no way prohibited from preaching on matters relating to, basic righteousness, if you will. So throughout the early years of the Nazi era anyway, the Nazis were always complaining that Catholic priests were preaching on politics. Because if they spoke about, be nice to Jews or be nice to any oppressed group, the Nazis said, you're getting into politics. The church said no. And the church had this separate appendix to the Concordat that verified and allowed them to do that. It also said that anybody who was baptized a Catholic was not subject to persecution. This allowed later in the war a lot of either false baptismal certificates or actual baptisms, a lot of people to avoid persecution. And in fact, Hitler ultimately complained about the Concordat and said it was thwarting a lot of what he wanted to do. But once the war was over, he'd be able to tear it up.
And then what about the encyclical that Pope Pius XI issued?
Mitbrenner Sorg is an amazing document, which, by the way, we have handwritten notes on original drafts. Pacelli wrote a good part of it because he was the best informed about Germany. This was, when it was translated in the Catholic Digest, the Catholic magazine in America, it was entitled "To the German People," because everybody knew that's what it was. This was not written in Latin like all encyclicals are. It was written in German. It was not released in Rome. It was smuggled into Germany. It was distributed to the churches on Palm Sunday, 1937, I believe, and was read from the pulpits. It was a very long, I always tease the priest that it was a very long mass that people had to put up with that day. And then it was pretty much never heard of again because the Nazis confiscated it. And they broke printing presses. They seized people who distributed it. They absolutely suppressed it. Pius the 11th took his one shot to get that statement in there, and the rest of the world, of course, could read it, but the Nazis suppressed it. And it talked about, in fact, it was said to have made Hitler really mad because it suggested he was being laughed at because he talked about only superficial minds could, try to capture all of God's greatness in a bloodline, one bloodline. Right. And it didn't specifically say Hitler or Germany, but there was no doubt that's what everyone was talking about.
In 1937, Hitler came to Rome. I want you to discuss what happened upon his arrival in Rome.
Well, in Rome, it's a big deal. Mussolini's always admired Hitler. Hitler actually admired Mussolini early in his career, and they're going to have these big celebrations. And I actually have a copy of a letter a priest wrote back to the United States saying, Rome certainly does brown up well. They were having celebrations and everything. Pope Pius XI and his Secretary of State, Eugenio Pacelli, left Rome. The Pope said, "The air in Rome makes me ill." And I've had a debate before. Susan Zuccotti, one of was critical, who tried to say that was a literal thing, that the Pope left because the air was making it. It was clearly not. On the feast day of the cross, he said it sickened him that the cross being worshipped in Rome was not the cross of Jesus. The Vatican was ordered shut. And dark, and priests and nuns were ordered not to partake in any festivities. They had to reroute the parade so as not to go past a dark Vatican, which would have been an insult to Hitler. I always say Hitler loved films of himself. He loves the film of him through the Arc de Triomphe in Paris or the Eiffel Tower. There are no films of him in the Sistine Chapel or at St. Peter's because it was closed to him. He was not welcome there. Believe me, if they had been open and available, there would have been tons of film of him walking through those places. And
to go back to the original question, then the Nazis were thrilled with the election of Pope Pius XII. Of course, it goes to show they were well aware that the right-hand man of Pope Pius XI was Eugenio Pacelli, and therefore they were not happy when he was elected as Pope.
They actually boycotted the coronation. They did. They were like the only nation in Europe that didn't send representatives to it. And yeah, so and it's silly to think otherwise.
So he becomes Pope, and within a few months, he then writes his first encyclical called Summi Pontificatus. Would you care to just briefly tell us about that?
Yeah. So Summi Pontificatus. This is interesting because it picks up on one that Pius XI was working on, but had problems in it. And there was a draft commissioned by Pope Pius XI of an encyclical. A lot of people thought it's a hidden encyclical that was going to really do all this great stuff, and Pius XII got rid of it. Not at all the case. That the so-called hidden encyclical had parts in it that were actually quite insulting to Jewish people. And so Pius XI rejected it. Pius XII rejected it, but took part of it. It took out the bad parts and put this part in where he laid out his view of what the church should do in a time of war. And the church's role is not to be a participant in the war. The church's role is to try to provide, for peace and security and sanctuary and help, things like that. I can't help but think of just recently, with Russia and Ukraine, Pope Francis placed a call, I guess, to Putin. I mean, I don't know the details, but that's the word. And I was reading through social media, and people were saying, well, I hope he told Putin off. I hope he did this. I hope he, and I'm like, that's not the Pope's role. The Pope isn't going to scare anybody. Stalin famously said, how many divisions does the Pope have? What the Pope can do is try to provide guidance and try to, cure the afflicted and help those who are suffering. And I hope that's what Pope Francis, I hope Pope Francis is trying to provide an exit ramp. Pope John the 23rd really helped a lot. It's not that well known, but with the Cuban Missile Crisis and providing an opportunity for Khrushchev to back down. So I think, I took a whole chapter in The War and the Pope and just discussed this one encyclical because I think he laid out a vision that he stayed with. Pius XII did. He said, here's my role. My role is not to be a combatant. My role is to, and a church's appropriate role is to try to de-escalate, to help, to save, and to be worried about the eternal as well. The Savior, the saving of souls. So you want to keep the church open and going.
I know the New York Times wrote relative to his encyclical that it is Germany that stands condemned above any country or movement in this encyclical, the Germany of Hitler and National Socialism. Of course, the Third Reich was not happy with the release.
I'm sorry. And that's the other thing. And that I got so far off on really talk about that. But it very clearly was talking about Germany is leading the world into disaster. Again, I didn't actually say Germany, but everyone knew. But he's saying, we're going to a situation where a horrible situation is developing, and everybody understood it was Germany. And here's what we can do as a church. Here's what I will try to do as Pope. But everyone understood it. Yeah. In fact, the New York Times headline, I think, if Pope condemns treaty violators, racists, urges restoring of Poland, all things very clearly that were directed at Germany.
So pretty soon after he's elected as Pope, of course, Germany invades Poland. So now we're smack dab in the beginnings of the war. I wanted to talk briefly about early in the war, the role of the resistance inside Germany and their kind of interplay with the Vatican. In particular, I know Mark Rieblin's book, The Church of Spies, kind of hits on this, and that is, of course, the role that Pope Pius XII played as intermediary between Britain and the resistance inside Germany. And just talk very briefly about that.
Yeah, Rieblin's book is fabulous, and it's about how, as they're trying to develop the resistance inside of Germany and trying to convince people to join in with going as far as assassination of Hitler, one of the things that they did, they had a lawyer from Munich named Joseph Mueller, who was also a pilot who could fly to Rome, and he became a private messenger, basically, between the Pope and the resistance people. And this is a lot of people know about Bonhoeffer. This is the Bonhoeffer group, or if you've seen the movie, Tom Cruise movie, title evading me, but Valkyrie.
Valkyrie.
It's that group, and they have messages from the Pope saying the Pope does not condemn this. The Pope is supportive of taking Hitler out. And Riebling in his book goes through a long analysis of why under Catholic doctrine it would have been justifiable to even kill Hitler. And he contrasts that with at least certain Protestant religions that would not have been acceptable, but under Catholic doctrine, it would be.
Kind of hard to be Hitler's Pope when you're trying to actively or work behind the scenes to take him
out. That's it. Why didn't he say more? Well, because he was trying to kill him.
What role did the persecution of the Danish clergy by the Nazi Party play in all future decisions of Pope Pius XII?
There are a couple of situations like this where messages got back to the Pope, and one of them was when the Germans moved in to Edith Stein, Saint Teresa Benedict of the Cross, is a great part of this story. She has been sent away from Germany when the Nazis rose to power, and then the Nazis come into Denmark, and they come into up across Holland and such, and the Christian leadership goes to the Nazi leaders and says, we've seen what you've done elsewhere. We're going to let the people know that, you're bad guys and you're doing horrible stuff. And the Nazi leaders say, if you do that, you'll really regret it. And the Catholic bishops said, we're telling them anyway. So the Catholic bishops came out with really strong statements against the Nazis. Protestant leaders, for the most part, actually backed off. And then there was a formal statement issued by the Nazi leadership that said, if the Catholic bishops can this way disregard our efforts to make peace, or however they phrase it, we must consider Jewish Jewish heritage Catholics, so Catholics of Jewish heritage, to be our worst enemies, and they'll be shipped off immediately. So people like Edith Stein, who was from a Jewish background but had become a Catholic nun, that baptismal certificate, we talked about the Concordat said baptism usually protected people. They said it's not going to protect in this case. So Edith Stein and others were sent off. The Pope gets notice of this and says the bishops making this statement led to this horrible retribution. What's that tell the Pope? It tells the Pope, gosh, I better not do this. I better not make, and there are other places. A similar thing happened in Poland, where he sent a note into the bishop who was left behind in Poland, and the bishop sent back a note thanking him profusely and saying, "But I'm not going to read it, because if I read this to the public, people will suffer for it. So thank you for your thoughts, but we're not going to make a statement."
I want to ask you, point blank, right? Because you hear this all the time. So was the Pope silent?
It wasn't at all silent. He was calculated in what he did. And we can look early in the war, early in the time, a lot of stuff on Vatican radio, which, by the way, you get executed for listening to Vatican radio inside of Germany. We had diplomatic interventions numerous times. He didn't use the bully pulpit. I mean, should he have used the bully pulpit? I think it's prudential judgment. He determined, based upon what he heard back from people in the Netherlands, people in Poland, people in the concentration camps. The word that came back to him was, when he spoke, things got worse. So he did not openly speak. Instead, he got involved in an assassination attempt. He sent money to victims all over the place. One of the new books, there's another new book out, Johann X, has not yet been published in English, but his book in Europe is doing very well, and it's showing just massive efforts the Pope undertook to help Jewish people provide relief to Jewish people. Letters that the Pope got requesting aid and his response to them.
And I know, I remember when I was working on my own book, Saving the Music, I met you at Mandina's restaurant for lunch one day.
I mean, you paid. I appreciate that.
You're welcome. I remember the way that you used the phrase, which it always resonated with me, and that was, when the Pope spoke, he spoke in papal speak, which in today's world, when you read his speeches, you may say, oh, well, he's not pointing out the Germans or the Nazis or the Jewish people. Yet in papal speak terms, everybody knew who he was talking about.
Exactly. And if you understand, it's like a different language a little bit. I mean, popes don't call out individuals, but everyone knew, the New York Times You referenced one editorial. You know, they said he's pointing his finger directly at Hitler. He was the only voice out of the silence of a continent because everyone understood what he was saying. And if you look across history, that's true of how popes speak. The message got through. You know, it's today we're looking back and saying, well, should have been more clear. Should have used the bully pulpit. Should have done this. Should have let a protest march down the streets. I remember on 60 Minutes, Ed Bradley asking Father Peter Gumpel, why didn't he lead a march down the street? You know, I mean, why he didn't is because it's not this era in the United States. It was that era under Nazi leadership. It's the impact of a demonstration like that would have been minimal and would have lasted, you know, a very short time, and the Vatican itself might not last so long either. There is a responsibility to try to you know, keep the church functioning.
One aspect that the critical scholars always bring up is, of course, the Roman roundup, and you know, it happened under his window, under his watch, and this was, of course, when the Jews who were living in the Jewish quarter inside Rome were rounded up, and 1,000 of them were ended up being sent to Auschwitz and were murdered. Can you just comment on the Roman roundup and kind of what Pope Pius's role was?
Yeah, well, you know, I mean, let's run it back a little bit. It's when when the Germans invaded their ally and occupied Rome. One of the first things they did is they went to the Jewish leadership and said, we want 50 kilograms of gold within 36 hours. And if you give us that, there'll be no deportations from Rome. Well, the chief rabbi of Rome, later Eugenio Zoli, blanking on his name at the time.
Israel Zoli.
Israel Zoli made his way into the Vatican disguised as a plumber, asked Vatican representatives for the gold. They got the message back from the Pope. Pope said, as much as you need for as long as you need it. Yeah, the Vatican would put up the ransom to stop it. Turns out that probably that ransom was never paid by the Vatican because the community itself raised sufficient funds to give the money to the Nazis. The Nazis, of course, this was just a ploy to get the gold. They got the gold and they started the roundups anyway. When the Pope apparently was greatly surprised. He was seen in tears when he heard about that, and he seemed to be in shock when he was first informed. He was shocked. He was not in shock. He was shocked. But he immediately went and got on the phone. He's had 2 separate messengers and a phone call placed to Berlin. They did get about 200 of the people who were rounded up released. These were primarily folks who were married to Christians or whatever, or, you know, Catholics or whatever. So there were some he got released, but about 1,200, I think, ultimately were deported, and I think all but 16 of them perished during the war. The Pope, what else could he have done? It seems that he tried several avenues. Maybe he could have done. Maybe he could have gone a different way. I mean, that's what people said. Why didn't you do this? Why did you try this thing and do that thing? He tried 3 different things. He did stop all subsequent significant roundups. There was never again a large roundup inside of Rome. The survival rate in Rome was much better than in comparable cities, comparable Jewish populations. It's tragic and horrible what happened to the Jews that were taken away. But to try to lay that on the Pope because he didn't take the precise means of protection that you would do. I mean, he did throw open virtually every church building in Rome, and there are stories, and I've talked to people who would like a guy who was in seminary told me they were already on wartime rations. They had so little food. And then the Pope sent them 100 more people to come live with them. And they had to reduce their portions to accommodate for them. And the Jewish people who were staying with them, they tried to provide kosher food when they could, and means to have celebrations for their ceremonies. And there are stories when they're in the midst of a Jewish ritual, and there's a knock on the door, and they break into singing the Ave Maria because they had to cover if they were caught. But even though that day was very bad, I think we can say that was a surprise. That was after the Pope had offered ransom to prevent it from happening. He took several efforts to try and stop it, and then it never happened again. So I think the answer there is the Nazis were really bad guys.
There was some testimony about some cloistered convents who would open their doors and take in Jewish refugees, which in today's world, you don't think much about it, but back in 1943, for a cloistered convent to open their doors to men and women and children was unheard of.
Absolutely. And those were, and it's interesting because you'll encounter some people say, well, the individual convents did it, this did it, but they can't find a directive from the Pope. There's not a written directive from the Pope. Everyone acted in uniformity in a particular way at a particular moment. They didn't use paper. Paper got people killed. But I think the evidence points clearly to there was a directive.
You mentioned the new book by Johann X, who's the archivist at the Vatican. He mentioned, at least an article I was reading, basically says that there was a Pacelli's list as well, a list of individuals who he was trying to rescue throughout Europe. Is that correct? Yeah.
That is kind of like Schindler's List. There was a list, and a lot. This was one example of Schindler. He had Jewish people working for him, right? That's one of the things, and you can accuse him of using slave labor, but he was also sheltering. Well, we know the Palatine Guard in the Vatican increased dramatically, like 20-fold during this time, and it's not because they had more guards. They had more people who were calling themselves guards. And they were sheltered that way. I mean, I got some pictures when I do slideshows where you see the Pope overseeing these loaves and loaves of bread and their trucks that are distributing them throughout Rome, and nuns and priests serving them to starving children. And pictures of displaced people sleeping all through the papal palace out at Castel Gandolfo. It's this was a time of extreme war, a terrible time. And we have critics saying, "Well, you should have done this, you should have done that." I mean, it's Monday morning quarterbacking at its absolute worst.
So I know he had a charitable office that he was running through the Vatican. Pope Pius did. I think Sister Priscillina, who we mentioned before, was running that office for him with Monsignor O'Flattery, which, of course, if you ever saw the movie, so I'm drawing a blank on
the Scarlet and the Black.
Scarlet and the Black. They were rescuing Jews, POWs, British POWs once they got whoever they could rescue.
Right.
They were rescuing. I came across a quote that she gave well after his death, but she said, after the war, people would always remark on how many Jews they'd saved. And she said, she was telling this young priest she was talking to, you have no idea, there wasn't any food. You hide the Jews, that's one thing, but now you've got to feed from 3 to 5 times a day. You've got to feed them. You've got kids, diapers. That's all this that we never think about. So that was kind of interesting. That's something you don't even think about. The part of,
we just think about hiding, but and that's when I talked to this priest, and this is probably 20 years ago now. I talked to an elderly priest who's a seminary. There was still pain in his voice. I mean, he knew it was the right thing to shelter those Jewish people, but he also, you could tell that, man, they had really little and they had to share it.
So I got two more points to make. The first would be in my little research relative to a fictional novel, which is nowhere near the research that you have to do for your book. But I came across numerous examples of praise being heaped upon priests and nuns who are in laity who saved Jewish people. And their response most of the time would be, I was only doing what Pope Pius XII wanted. Their actions get praised, and yet the person who they are praising gets vilified. And I just wanted to get your comment on that because I see it all the time.
Yeah, no, and you're right. It is, and that goes to show a couple things. It goes to show, number one, that they knew what the Pope wanted. They knew what the Pope. It's the Pope speak. They understood Pope speak at the time, and there's that. Then there's also, yeah, I mean, one of my sayings when I wrap things up usually is I say, look, the people who were there are the victims who thanked Pius, the rescuers who said he was their inspiration, and the villains who despise Pius. Those are the people we need to be listening to. People today who are trying to reconstruct things in 2022 world, and with the freedoms and protections we have today that simply did not exist at that time.
And then my last comment would be, it's appropriate that today we're recording this podcast on June 6th, which of course is the anniversary of D-Day. Because I wonder how much of this is, the Pope should have done this, the Pope should have done that, and therefore he could have effectively, saved the world, right? I think the problem is that in June 6th kind of shows it, the only way that any of this would have ended was with the complete annihilation of the Third Reich. There was really no other solution.
Yeah.
And, there's really not much he could have done other than throw his, to do what he did behind the scenes to try to save people and help people.
The Holocaust was only possible because of the war, and Pius XII did everything he could do to try to stop the war. In fact, some people who criticize him, he was probably willing to concede more to Germany to prevent the war than maybe he should have, or a lot of people would have. But if you prevented the war, you stopped the war, the Holocaust can't go on. And I always say that Pius XII, I think, did more for the Jews than anybody except perhaps, I usually say the American army, but we'll say the Allied armies, because the Allied armies is really what ultimately stopped the Holocaust.
Correct. Well, Ron, I thought this was very informative. Thank you so much, and good luck in all of your future endeavors.
Thanks, Chip. I appreciate it. I enjoyed it very much too.